A starving settler widow with twin girls, alone, came to a stranger's rancher door. She only asked for shelter, but he wanted more. The prairie at dawn lay silvered in dew, each blade of grass bending beneath the weight of a spring mist that lingered as though reluctant to leave the earth. The sky had not yet decided on its color, half shadowed with the last whispers of night, half awash in pale lavender promise. Across that wide, empty horizon moved a woman with 2 children pressed against her sides, their steps uncertain, their clothes little more than faded cloth stitched and restitched to endure one more mile. Eliza May Turner's frame was thin, but she carried herself with the stubborn strength of one who had been carrying more than her own weight for too many years. Every step she took was for the small hands gripping her dress, the tired voices that had whispered through the night that they were hungry, Mama, so hungry. She did not speak of her own hunger, nor of the gnawing ache in her chest that had become more familiar than the memory of warmth. Her lips were cracked, her eyes shadowed, but her stride remained steady. The twins, Clara and Ruth, were 6 years old and already wore the quiet eyes of children who had seen too much want. They clung to their mother's skirts, their faces pale beneath streaks of dust. Ruth carried a limp doll made of cloth scraps, its button eyes long since gone. Clara hummed softly, a habit she had taken from her mother, a way to fight the silence that pressed in when one dared not speak of despair. Ahead, the smoke of a chimney curled into the sky. Eliza stopped on the ridge, her breath hitching at the sight. A cabin stood against the swelling morning light, solitary on the land, its logs weather-darkened but solid. Beyond it stretched acres of prairie grass broken only by a corral and a stand of cottonwoods near a trickle of water. The smoke from that chimney rose straight and sure, and with it came the faintest suggestion of bread baking, of coffee warmed on an iron stove. The smell was not truly there, she told herself. It was her mind weaving illusions from memory. And yet her daughters lifted their faces as though they smelled it too. "Mama," Clara whispered, "there's a house." Eliza nodded, pressing a hand to each girl's head. "Yes, my doves. Just a little more." Her heart thundered in her chest. It was no small thing to stand at a stranger's door and beg for shelter. She had told herself along the long trail that she would never do it, that she would find work in town or barter for food. But the town was far yet, and her children's ribs pressed sharp beneath her palms. Whatever shame waited inside that cabin, it could not outweigh their need. She approached slowly, every step across the yard measured. The cabin loomed larger with each footfall. She noted its sturdy door, the hitching post scarred by use, the stack of split wood carefully arranged against the wall. All spoke of a man who labored with discipline, who wasted neither time nor resource. She prayed silently he had mercy enough to spare. The twins clung close as she raised her hand and rapped against the heavy wood. The sound echoed in the still morning like the striking of iron on stone. Silence followed, heavy and long, until the door swung inward. The man who filled its frame was tall, broad in shoulder and chest, his face worn by weather and solitude. Jedediah Boone's eyes were flint-gray, narrowed as though he did not trust the light itself. His shirt was plain, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with muscle, hands calloused from years of rope, plow, and axe. He regarded her without a word, his silence louder than any greeting could have been. Eliza swallowed the knot in her throat. Her voice trembled but did not break. "Sir, we've walked far. My girls and I have nowhere tonight. We ask only a roof, for a little while. I can work. I can cook, sew, mend. We will not be a burden." The twins pressed closer, staring up at him with wide, hollow eyes. Jedediah did not answer immediately. His gaze swept over the woman and her children, reading hunger in their cheeks, exhaustion in their posture. He had known hardship himself. It lived in the hollow of his chest even now. Yet years alone had hardened him against unexpected knocks at his door. Strangers brought trouble, mouths meant more labor, and pity was a luxury he had long ceased to afford. Still, those small eyes would not release him. Clara's hand tightened around her sister's, and Ruth's lip trembled as she glanced at the faint smoke behind him. Jedediah's jaw tightened. He stepped aside a fraction, not enough to invite them in, but enough to reveal the dim interior of the cabin, the table set with bread and tin cups, the faint orange glow of the fire. His voice, when it came, was gravel pulled across stone. "Barn's empty. You'll find straw there. Keep to yourselves." Relief flooded Eliza, though it came mixed with humiliation. She lowered her head in gratitude. "Thank you, sir. Truly." He gave no reply, only shut the door with the finality of a man who lived behind walls both wood and invisible. Eliza led her daughters to the barn. The wooden structure smelled of hay and horses long gone. Its loft was empty, its corners shadowed, but compared to the open night it was sanctuary. She spread her worn shawl upon the straw and laid the twins down. Their faces eased as they touched the hay, as though even this rough bed was a treasure. She tucked the shawl around them, smoothing their hair with trembling hands. They whispered questions. Would they have bread soon? Would the man be kind? Eliza hushed them with the promise that tomorrow might be gentler than today. When their breathing slowed into the shallow rhythm of sleep, she knelt in the straw and pressed her hands together. Not in prayer for herself, but for the two small bodies beside her. She had long ceased asking for mercy for her own soul. Outside, Jedediah Boone leaned against the doorframe of his cabin, watching the barn through narrowed eyes. He had turned them away from his hearth, yet something in the sight of that woman's bowed head haunted him. He had known men who sought comfort without cost, women who offered themselves cheaply for bread, but this one had carried herself differently. Her request had been plain, stripped of pride yet clothed in dignity. The prairie wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound from the barn, a child's laugh, quickly hushed, then silence. Jedediah looked toward the horizon, where the first bold streak of sunlight cut through mist. For the first time in many years, he felt the weight of his own solitude pressing against him not as armor, but as burden. Inside the barn, Eliza lay down beside her daughters, the smell of straw sharp in her nostrils, her heart both eased and unsettled. They had shelter for tonight. Yet she knew this was only the beginning, for the man in that cabin had not opened his door, only his barn, and she could feel the unspoken cost of his silence pressing in like a storm yet to break. And as her eyes drifted closed, unaware of his watch from the shadows, the question lingered between them across the yard. Was this mercy, or a test, and what more might he ask before the spring was through? The first mornings in the barn were stitched with both gratitude and ache. Eliza rose before the girls stirred, her body sore from straw and stone, her heart pressed thin between shame and determination. She slipped outside while mist still clung to the prairie and began gathering water from the creek, her reflection shivering in the current. Cheeks gaunt, hair tangled, eyes with the faraway look of someone who had walked too long with sorrow. She carried the pail to the cabin door, set it down quietly, and left before Jedediah Boone could speak. Inside the barn, Clara and Ruth stirred, giggling faintly as they combed fingers through each other's hair. Their laughter was soft, tentative, as though afraid to draw attention, yet it clung to Eliza's ears as she worked. She scrubbed his floors with rags worn thin, patched the frayed edges of his tablecloth, and cooked the beans he left on the porch, though he seldom sat with them. Their meals were simple: cornbread, beans, once a rabbit he had shot and skinned, yet to the girls, each bite tasted of miracle. Jedediah kept his distance. His presence was felt more than seen, the heavy tread of his boots across the porch, the scrape of wood as he split logs, the grunt as he hauled buckets from the well. He spoke little, and when he did, it was with a tone as spare as the land itself. Still, he noticed the way Eliza moved through work with quiet diligence, never asking for more than was given, never wasting a scrap or a moment. One evening, after a week of silence broken only by chores, Jedediah left a small sack of flour on the step. Eliza found it at dawn, her breath catching as she lifted it into her arms. She baked bread, the scent filling the barn and curling into the rafters. The twins' faces lit with wonder, crumbs clinging to their cheeks as they devoured each piece. Eliza ate sparingly, saving most for them. When Jedediah came in from the fields, she had left a small loaf on his table without a word. He ate alone, yet his jaw moved more slowly, as though each bite carried weight beyond hunger. But mercy is never left untested on the prairie. When Eliza ventured into town for thread and salt, the eyes followed her. Silas Reed, broad of chest and quick of tongue, leaned against the post outside the mercantile, his hat tipped low. He looked her over with a smirk that stripped more than cloth could cover. "So Boone's taken in strays," he drawled, his words meant for all within earshot. "Guess a man's loneliness will do that. Folks say a woman'll trade anything for shelter when her belly's empty enough." Eliza's face flushed, but she held her head high. She gathered her purchases with hands that shook only when hidden by her shawl. Clara and Ruth clutched her skirts, their ears burning with whispers they could not understand but would not forget. Inside the mercantile, Martha Boone stood by the counter, her arms folded like iron. Jedediah's sister-in-law had come to town on errands of her own, and her gaze swept Eliza with cool judgment. Later that evening she rode up to Jedediah's cabin, her bonnet pulled tight against the wind, her lips pursed into a line that had never known softness. "You know what they're saying," she told him, her voice sharp as frost. "That you keep a widow in your barn and let her scrub your floors like a servant. It won't sit well. Not with the churchwomen, not with the men who measure a man's worth by his pride." Jedediah said nothing, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed toward the fading light. Martha pressed on, her tone tightening. "If it were only her, perhaps. But she's got those girls clinging to her skirts. It looks improper. And Silas is stirring it, saying things no woman should have to hear." Jedediah's jaw tightened, but his silence was not surrender. Martha, dissatisfied, muttered a warning about shame and left in a clatter of hooves. That night, Eliza sat in the barn sewing patches into the girls' dresses by lantern light. Her fingers bled where the needle slipped, but she did not stop. Jedediah stepped to the doorway, his shadow cast long across the straw. For a moment, he simply watched her, how she bent over the cloth with quiet devotion, how the twins leaned against her shoulders, their eyes half closed in trust. "You'll catch talk," he said finally, his voice low, rough. Eliza looked up, startled by the sound. Her eyes, dark and rimmed with weariness, held his for a breath before lowering. "Let them talk. My children breathe tonight. That is enough." Jedediah's throat worked as though to speak again, but no words came. He left the doorway, boots crunching in the dirt. Eliza's eyes lingered on the place where he had stood, her chest tight with something unnameable. Spring rains swept the plains, filling the air with the scent of wet earth. Days blurred into rhythm. Chores, meals, the sound of axes splitting wood, the laughter of children chasing each other in the mud. Yet whispers grew louder each time Eliza entered town. Some women turned their faces away, others whispered behind gloved hands. Silas grew bolder, once stepping into her path with a mock bow, his words dripping poison. "You deserve better than Boone's barn, Miss Turner. A man like me could give you a proper home. All you'd need to do is show a little gratitude." Eliza's hand tightened around Clara's shoulder, her body rigid. "I have what I need," she said softly, and walked past him. But her voice shook as she spoke, and he laughed, loud enough for all to hear. Jedediah heard of it before she returned home. The air between them that evening was taut, filled with words unsaid. Eliza busied herself with the fire, the girls curled near her feet, while Jedediah stood near the door, his fists clenching and unclenching. At last he muttered, "Silas ought to be taught his place." Eliza looked up, her eyes steady. "Fighting him won't quiet tongues. It will only make them sharper." Jedediah met her gaze, and for the first time there was no wall in his eyes, only the raw edge of something that might have been protectiveness, or anger, or both. He said nothing more, but that silence carried the weight of storm clouds. The days that followed were marked by small gestures that neither spoke of. Jedediah left an extra log by the fire each morning. Eliza mended his torn shirt and placed it folded on the table. The twins began to laugh more freely, running barefoot in the greening grass, their voices lifting against the wide sky. For a time, it felt as though the world might forget its cruel whispers. But the prairie remembers, and so do the people who live upon it. One evening, as thunder rolled on the horizon, a sudden downpour forced Jedediah to make a choice. The barn roof leaked, and the girls shivered in damp shawls. Without a word, he opened the cabin door and gestured them inside. Eliza hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding with the knowledge of what it might mean. The girls clutched her hands, their eyes wide at the sight of the hearth fire glowing warm, the table set, the bed in the corner. For the first time, they would sleep under a roof that was not draught and straw. She led them in slowly, each step both gift and risk. The fire snapped, the shadows danced along the walls, and outside the storm hammered against the earth. Jedediah stood apart, his eyes unreadable, but he did not send them back. The twins curled near the hearth, their faces soft with wonder. Eliza laid her shawl across them, smoothing their hair, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, the world was only firelight and the steady breathing of her children. Jedediah watched from his chair, his face stern but his gaze lingering. He saw not a beggar, not a burden, but a woman who carried dignity like armor, who bore shame without surrender. And for the first time in many years, he felt the silence of his cabin crack, not broken, but shifted, as though something long buried was stirring awake. The storm raged through the night, and when morning came, the prairie lay washed clean. Yet in town, the tongues would wag louder than ever, for now the widow and her twins had crossed the threshold. And though no words were spoken between them, Eliza and Jedediah both knew the truth. What had begun as shelter was becoming something deeper, and with it came the weight of choice neither could yet name. And as the girls slept by the hearth, Eliza lay awake, staring at the rafters, listening to the rain drip from the eaves. In the quiet, she felt both fear and longing settle in her chest. For though the cabin walls held them warm, the world outside had teeth, and soon enough, someone would come knocking again. The prairie thawed beneath the touch of spring, each day shedding the weight of winter's silence. Grass pushed through soil once cracked and barren, the cottonwoods shimmered green with fresh leaves, and the air was alive with the sound of water rushing swift from melting snows in distant hills. For Eliza, each dawn carried the faintest breath of renewal, though habit kept her shoulders bowed, her eyes wary. A life that had been only hardship did not surrender its memory easily. Yet the twins bloomed as the land did. Clara and Ruth ran barefoot through the soft grass, their laughter rising like meadowlarks startled from the earth. They played in the yard with sticks turned into horses, stones into treasures. Their cheeks filled, their voices lifted, and Eliza watched them with a heart that ached from both gratitude and fear. She had asked only for survival, but what lay before her was something gentler, something that whispered of belonging. Inside the cabin, Jedediah Boone moved with the rhythm of a man who had long worked alone, yet his steps began to adjust, his silences shifted. He still spoke little, but his gestures carried weight. When Eliza's shoes began to fray, he took them to his workbench without a word and stitched new soles with calloused hands. When the twins tried to draw water from the heavy well bucket, he lifted it for them, his eyes softening as their small fingers trailed across the wooden handle. One morning, Eliza found a carved toy horse on the table. The twins' eyes lit as though the sun had fallen into their hands. Ruth named it Dusty, Clara insisted it could run faster than any wild stallion, and together they galloped it across the floor. Jedediah watched from the doorway, his face unreadable, but when Eliza glanced up, she saw the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. It was gone as quickly as it came, but it left her breath unsteady. The rhythm of the days drew them together without force, like streams merging unseen. Eliza cooked simple meals, beans, bread, occasionally rabbit stew, and set the table for all, though Jedediah often ate last, his portions smaller. She noticed he left the choicest pieces for the twins, though he pretended otherwise. When she tried to thank him, he only grunted, yet his silence no longer cut as sharply. It felt less like a wall, more like a shield he was still learning to lower. Spring sunlight poured across the fields, and Jedediah began to teach the girls to ride his old mare, a patient creature with a sway in her back. At first Eliza feared, clutching the fence rail as her daughters climbed awkwardly onto the saddle, but Jedediah's hands steadied them, his voice calm and sure. The twins laughed wildly as the mare trotted in slow circles, their braids flying, their joy loud enough to wake something long dormant in the cabin walls. That evening, Eliza found herself humming as she kneaded dough, the tune one her mother had sung long ago. The sound startled her. It had been years since music left her lips. She faltered, but then Clara and Ruth picked it up, their voices thin and sweet. Jedediah sat at the table sharpening his knife, his head bent, but when the song ended, he did not move for a long moment. The air between them carried the echo, soft as candlelight. In town, however, shadows lengthened. Silas Reed's smirk grew bolder each time Eliza walked past. He leaned in doorways, his words sharp enough to cut though couched in charm. "Boone's got himself a housekeeper," he told anyone who would listen, "and she don't cost him a dime." The whispers coiled like snakes, reaching Eliza's ears in the tilt of glances, the hush of women's voices behind her. She bore it with quiet dignity, her spine straighter for the children's sake, but at night she lay awake, listening to the steady breathing of the twins, and wondered how long dignity alone could shield them. Jedediah heard the whispers too. When he rode into town for supplies, men muttered, testing his patience, watching for cracks in his composure. He ignored them, but each word was tinder laid at the edges of his restraint. Only when he returned home, the prairie stretching wide around him, did he breathe freely. One afternoon, Eliza sat sewing near the window while Jedediah mended harness leather at the table. The twins played outside with their wooden horse, their laughter drifting in through the open door. For a long while, only the sound of needle through cloth and knife against leather filled the cabin. Then Eliza lifted her eyes. "You eat less than you should," she said quietly. Jedediah looked up, his gaze steady. "Work fills a man better than food." Her lips curved into something between sorrow and a smile. "Perhaps. But not forever." He held her gaze longer than he meant to, the air between them tightening. At last he looked away, returning to the leather. Yet that night, when supper was laid out, he took his portion without leaving the best pieces behind. The twins noticed but said nothing, though their eyes flicked toward Eliza, who lowered her gaze to hide the warmth in her chest. Spring deepened. Fields greened, wildflowers spilled across the meadows, and the air was thick with the hum of bees. The cabin, once a place of silence, now carried the sounds of life, laughter, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices in the evening. Jedediah, who had long sat alone at his table, now found himself listening as Eliza told the twins old stories, her voice soft, carrying threads of memory she had not spoken in years. Yet the gossip did not fade. Silas pressed harder, emboldened by her quiet refusals. Once, as she left the mercantile, he reached for her arm, his grip firm. "You think Boone will keep you forever," he hissed. "A woman like you needs a man who can claim her proper." Eliza pulled free, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She said nothing, only gathered her daughters and walked away. But the bruise on her arm bloomed dark by evening, and when Jedediah saw it, his hand curled into a fist so tight his knuckles whitened. He did not speak of it, but his silence was heavier than words, and Eliza felt it press against her even as she stitched by the fire. One night, long after the twins had fallen asleep, Eliza sat alone by the hearth, the firelight painting her face in gold and shadow. She held the worn shawl that had carried her through so many miles, her fingers tracing its frayed edges. Jedediah returned from the porch, his boots quiet on the floorboards. For a long moment he stood watching her, the weight of his solitude pressing against the fragile warmth that had entered his life. "You'll leave come summer," he said at last, his voice rough. Eliza looked up, startled. "Why would I?" "Because folk will drive you out. Their tongues cut sharper than any blade." Her eyes did not waver. "Then let them cut. I've weathered worse. My girls need a roof more than I fear words." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. Jedediah's face softened, though his voice remained quiet. "You've more grit than most men I've known." Her lips trembled into the faintest smile. "And yet I'd trade every ounce of it for one day of peace." He said nothing more, but when he turned away, his shoulders bore a different weight, one not of solitude, but of responsibility. The days passed, each one stitching them closer. Jedediah began to linger when Eliza sang, to listen longer when she spoke. He showed the twins how to plant seeds in small rows, their tiny fingers dropping kernels into soil. The girls called him the big man still, but their eyes sought him with trust, their laughter louder when he was near. One evening, as dusk bled across the prairie, Eliza placed a loaf of bread on the table. The twins were already asleep, their heads on each other's shoulders. She lingered at the hearth, smoothing her skirt, uncertain why her breath came fast. Jedediah sat at the table, the lamplight catching the scar on his jaw, his eyes fixed on the bread. When he looked up, their gazes locked, and in that stillness lay something unspoken, heavy as the horizon. "Thank you," she whispered, the words trembling as though unused for years. Jedediah's jaw worked, but no reply came. He only inclined his head, his eyes holding hers longer than silence usually allowed. For Eliza, the moment carried more weight than any declaration. It was not words she needed, but the steady recognition of a man who saw her not as burden, not as shame, but as woman. The fire burned low, shadows stretched long, and the prairie outside lay hushed. Yet inside, something fragile had taken root. It was not love declared, not yet, but trust, small, steady, blooming like the first wildflower through thawed earth. Eliza went to her bedroll near the girls, her heart unsteady, her breath caught between hope and fear. Jedediah remained at the table, staring at the empty plate, the silence pressing close. For years he had built walls higher than any fence, but tonight he felt them shift, felt something alive move within their cracks. And though no words were spoken, both knew the truth. What had begun as survival was becoming choice. Yet in the distance, thunder rolled, faint but certain, a reminder that storms come even in spring. The prairie that spring looked like a sea unbroken, green waves rising and falling beneath the restless wind. But no land, no matter how vast, can hide a rumor once it takes root in town. By May, the whispers about Eliza and her daughters had grown into talk spoken openly, stirred by Silas Reed with every drink he poured into his mouth and every careless word he loosed into the air. What had begun as mutterings, Boone keeping a widow in his barn, Boone feeding mouths that weren't his, turned into laughter and cruel suggestion. They called Eliza shameless, said her daughters would grow to be the same, and the poison spread through church pews and across hitching rails until it came back to her like echoes she could not silence. Eliza bore it with chin lifted, her hands steady as she held the girls close when in town. Yet she felt it all the same, each look and each whisper a stone laid on her chest. Shame was no stranger to her. It had walked beside her since her husband's gambling left her near destitute, since fever took him and left her with 2 hungry mouths. But never had it cut so deeply, for now the shame was not only hers to endure, it touched the daughters she had sworn to shield. Jedediah Boone said little when he heard the rumors, but the stillness in his eyes grew harder, like steel tempered in fire. He went about his work with an intensity that left blisters raw on his palms, his silence heavy as thunder building on the horizon. Eliza knew he was wrestling with something unspoken, but she did not dare ask. To press him might break whatever fragile trust had been growing between them. One afternoon, Silas Reed cornered her outside the mercantile. His hat tipped low, his mouth pulled into a smirk, he stepped too close, his voice a mockery of kindness. "You don't belong in Boone's shadow, Miss Turner. A woman like you needs a man with means. I could give you that roof proper, if only you'd show some gratitude. Wouldn't take much. Just a nod, a smile, a promise." His hand brushed against her sleeve, and though she pulled away, the touch left a stain she could not scrub clean. Clara and Ruth clung to her skirts, their wide eyes drinking in what they did not yet understand but would remember nonetheless. Eliza turned from Silas without a word, but her silence burned, and the bruise of it lingered longer than any mark on her skin. That night, after the girls slept by the fire, Eliza packed quietly. She folded what little they had into her worn shawl, 2 dresses, a few scraps of cloth, the wooden horse Jedediah had carved for the twins. She moved as one who knew the path of exile well, her heart ached but her face calm. Better to leave than to bring ruin to the man who had given them shelter. Better to walk under open sky again than to watch him crushed beneath gossip meant for her. When she lifted the latch on the door, a voice stopped her. "You think leaving will silence them?" She turned. Jedediah stood in the shadows, his eyes pale fire in the lamplight, his voice low and ragged. His fists were clenched, not in anger at her, but in restraint against something larger than himself. "I won't have you bear this weight," she whispered. "It's mine, not yours. They'll drive us both out." "They've tried to drive me out since the day I set foot here," he said, stepping closer, the boards creaking under his boots. "This land wasn't theirs to give, nor theirs to take, and neither are you. I don't want a servant, Eliza. I don't want someone who feels they owe me. I want—" He faltered, his breath uneven, his jaw tight with words that had long been kept caged. At last he said, softer than the prairie wind, "I want a home." Her hands trembled, the shawl slipping to the floor. "A home," she echoed, as if testing the sound of it against her lips. His eyes held hers, unflinching. "Not out of debt, not out of pity, out of choice." Tears burned her eyes, but she did not look away. She had carried shame and hunger, had begged at doors, had known the sting of rejection. Never had she been asked, not demanded, not pitted, but asked, as though her will mattered. Slowly, she stepped toward him, her voice breaking. "Then I will choose. For my girls. For myself." In that moment, the cabin walls seemed to breathe, the silence no longer suffocating but alive with possibility. The twins stirred, their small voices lifting sleepily. "Papa," they whispered, as though the word had been waiting on their tongues. Jedediah's eyes closed, his breath shuddering as though the sound itself struck the deepest part of him. But peace, even when near, does not arrive without test. That night, rain swept across the prairie, and with it came Silas Reed, half drunk, his boots slipping in the mud. He pounded on the cabin door, his voice slurred but sharp with intent. "You think you can keep her, Boone? She's mine to take if I want. Everybody knows it." The twins startled awake, fear spilling from their eyes. Eliza pulled them close, her heart hammering. Jedediah rose, his frame filling the doorway as he opened it to the storm. Silas staggered forward, rain plastering his hair to his head, his grin twisted. "You can't stand against a whole town's talk. Best hand her over before they turn on you. A widow doesn't belong here, she belongs with a man who knows her worth." Jedediah's voice was low, steady as the rumble of thunder. "You'll not speak her name again. You'll not come near this door." Silas sneered, stepping closer. "And if I do?" Jedediah's fist met his jaw, the sound cracking louder than the storm outside. Silas fell into the mud, cursing, scrambling to rise, but Jedediah stood over him like a mountain unmoved. "Go home," he growled, his voice carrying not only warning but finality. "Or next time, you won't walk away." Silas staggered into the night, his curses swallowed by the rain. Jedediah shut the door, his chest heaving, his hand bruised but steady. The cabin was quiet save for the storm outside and the quickened breaths within. Eliza looked at him, her daughters pressed against her skirts. She saw not only the strength of his body but the choice he had made, to stand not for pride, but for them. In her heart, something long dormant unfurled, fragile but fierce. When the storm eased, dawn came with a sky washed clean, streaked in rose and gold. The cabin, too, felt different, not just wood and stone but something more, a place claimed, a sanctuary built not by walls but by the lives within them. The twins ran into the yard, their laughter rising with the morning larks, their small hands clutching wildflowers damp with dew. Eliza stood on the porch, the shawl still folded in her arms, her eyes glistening as she watched them. Jedediah stepped beside her, his presence solid, his silence no longer heavy but companionable. For the first time in many years, she felt herself breathe without fear. She turned to him, her voice soft but certain. "You've given us more than shelter." He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "No. You gave me what I was missing, a reason to open the door." Her hand brushed his, tentative but sure, and for once he did not pull away. The prairie stretched wide before them, the wind carrying the promise of summer. They stood together, no longer strangers bound by necessity, but a family formed in the quiet forge of trust. And though the town's whispers would not die easily, they mattered less than the voices of two little girls calling for their mother, calling for their new father, their laughter loud enough to scatter the last shadows of loneliness. The day unfolded, bright and clear, yet Eliza knew storms would come again, as storms always do. But now she was not alone. Now she had a place where shame could not root, where kindness and choice had taken its place. That night, as the prairie darkened and the stars burned fierce in the endless sky, Eliza sat by the fire with her daughters nestled against her. Jedediah sat close, his chair angled toward the hearth, his gaze steady but softened. Silence lay between them, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of belonging, of peace hard-earned. And as the flames flickered low, Eliza let her eyes close, her lips curving with the faintest smile. She had knocked once on a door only asking for shelter, but what she had found was more than shelter, more than survival. She had found a home.